Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm told you are, the smartest high school students in Florida? Is that it? That's not what my kid says in Virginia. Are you guys smarter than the kids in Virginia? Really? All right. Who is the shortest American president? James Madison. That's very good. Oh, don't get cocky. All right. Who is the last president to have the White House lawn cut by goats? Ha! Not so smart, are you? Woodrow Wilson. You said that? Well, there you go. Curve breaker. All right, maybe you're as smart as they say you are. Now, it's a great pleasure to have followed my friend Nadine, who is one of the great voices of civil liberties, and to be here with Congressman Frey, who's one of the great champions of civil liberties in Congress. And it's a great pleasure to be in front of you, because you are going to basically answer the questions that I'm going to raise today. It's a great burden when you're in high school and you suddenly realize that you're going to be a citizen, a full adult citizen, and you try to think what that means. You're living, as the Chinese curse says, in interesting times. This country is changing, and the question, is it changing for the better? It's going to be your generation that will determine whether we lose ground on civil liberties and become something different, or whether we'll fight for what we were and hopefully what we are. Federalism is important about that. It doesn't sound like that. It's not, you don't hear people really talking about federalism. You actually don't hear liberals talking about federalism much. I belong to the smallest group in the world, a social liberal who believes in federalism. And I'll tell you why. Federalism is the relationship of the federal government to the states. It sounds sort of dry. But it was one of the most important things that the framers put in the Constitution. And it's under attack. See, the framers believed that liberties are safest when they're held closest to us. They're sort of like the things that are most valuable to you, where do you keep them? You don't keep them in your locker at school, except for the stuff you don't want your parents to see. But you tend to put the things that you cherish the most close to you, close to your bed, in your room, locked away. Rights are the same way. The framers believed that our rights and liberties were safest if they were closest to us. And that meant that most of our rights belonged to the states. That is, we have an amendment in the Constitution that says that all those rights not expressly given to the federal government remain with the states. And that means that the United States really is a collection of 50 sovereign states. It allows each of us in Florida and Virginia, Utah and Maine to experiment with ways of living. But it also means that most of the rights that we have are protected by our state officials. It's very important because a democracy is only as good as you think it is. It's only as good as you are involved in it. And you're more involved with your state representatives, your state politics, because it's attainable, it's reachable, it's right there. We're living in changing times because people are feeling that their government is somehow remotely located. It's in Washington or it's in the United Nations. It's separate from you. It's those people, not us. That's dangerous because we're living in sort of a virtual democracy. You all, more than any other generation, know that. You're much more comfortable living in virtual space. You live there. You're on the computer. You can now play Minecraft with a kid in Beijing. You can now have a friend in San Jose. People in the United States no longer identify themselves by their states. It used to be that when the revolution started and you went up to someone right after the republic was created and you'd say, "Who are you?" And they'd say, "I'm a Virginian," or "I'm a Floridian." Very few of them would say that they're an American. Now, I'm glad people say they're an American, but there's less identification now with their states, that people now move so freely. And that means there's less communication, less context, less community where you live. I hope most of you are going to go to college. And you'll probably go as far from your parents as you can possibly get. I know that was my priority. But then you're going to be starting part of your life living among strangers. Today, people living in Washington or Miami probably don't even know their neighbors living in their apartment. They probably have more communication with someone 2,000 miles away than they do someone who's just 10 feet away. Now, we got to ask ourselves, what does that do to a political system when we're no longer rooted where we are? We're no longer engaging the politics where we are. Who is it that determines our rights? How much are we involved in that discussion? Now, when James Madison, and I must say I'm a Madisonian scholar, I'm not a Jeffersonian scholar. It's sort of like the Sharks and the Jets in West Side Story. I think Jefferson's overrated and Madison is underrated. He only wrote the Constitution. I don't know why we would care about him. James Madison was a profound thinker. I mean, I'm not putting any dispersions on Thomas Jefferson, but James Madison was sort of a dweeb. You know, if he was alive today, he'd probably be inventing a .com in his garage. Okay? He was this short little guy with a squeaky voice who did nothing but read about government. That's all he cared about. Before government was cool, this guy was constantly. I remember reading a letter. I was doing a book on Alexander Hamilton and researching this book, and I remember finding this original letter from Madison to Jefferson. And Jefferson was an ambassador in Paris, and Madison was saying, "Why aren't you sending me more books on government?" Because back then, Paris was the book capital of the world. You wanted books, you had to go to Paris. That's where you really found books. And in fact, where Jefferson was going to buy books, I was just in Paris, and I walked on the same street. It's still still sells books on that street for hundreds of years. Madison was saying, "Why don't you buy me more books?" And Jefferson wrote back, saying, "For God's sake, I've sent you a couple dozen books on government," because Madison would just devour books on government. He wanted to know what makes governments work. And more importantly, what makes governments fail. He was a realist. By the way, he didn't have a lot of false notions about human beings. If anything, he was a little bit pessimistic about human beings. He thought humans are pretty flawed. They tended to be corrupt. Not corrupt in the bribe sense, but they tended to form factions and petty divisions and hatreds. And he wanted to build a government that would recognize all of our faults and still protect freedom. And he realized the way to do that was to divide it. That was the difference between the U.S. experiment and the French experiment. We went with divided government. And it was a big difference. You know, I was part of this institute that a few years back was working with the State Department, trying to get some of these new emerging countries in Eastern Europe to adopt the U.S. Constitution. It's when all of a sudden Soviet Union broke up and there was like 20 new countries. You know, like Poland and Ukraine, they suddenly were going to reinvent themselves. So we brought them over to the United States. These were from ministers, and we'd bring the ministers over and we'd just teach them about the Constitution. And one of my former colleagues at Tulane, Jerome Huet, actually created it. He was the head of an institute in Paris. They were trying to get him to adopt the French Constitution, God help him. And I remember the one thing that we brought all these Russian ministers, and Jerome found out about it and brought them to Paris before I could get my hands on them. So they went through this thing in Paris, and the Russian military minister, the defense minister, I said, "How was Jerome?" And he said, well, Professor Youette said, don't listen to Turley. He's going to tell you about this man, James Madison. You know, the Madisonian democracy. Don't listen to him. The Madisonian democracy is an ugly system. That's what he said. It's literally the only thing Jerome ever said in his academic career I agreed with. It is an ugly system. Yeah, you read the Constitution, you got copies. If you come to me and say, I just think the Constitution's a beautiful thing, then I'm going to say, read the Constitution. Okay, I love the Constitution, but it's not. It was written by a wonk. It was written by a dweeb. It reads like the IRS code. There's nothing beautiful in that Constitution. You read the French Constitution, man, that baby sings. I mean, no one writes a Constitution like the French, right? And it's one of the reasons why it failed on a weekly basis. Right? That while we created this Constitution that lasted, went through all types of weather. It's sort of the all-terrain vehicles of constitutions. Go through mud, go through sand. Just doesn't look good. The French had these beautiful things, and they'd last for about 48 hours. The problem with the French Constitution is it was written on what I call the I love you man moment, the Bud Light moment. Remember those Bud Light commercials where they say, I love you man, he tries to grab the beer? That's the problem with the French guy who's written at that I love you man moment. See, the French would overthrow the previous government, and they would have a wonderful party. That's what the French do. They have wonderful parties. I encourage you to go party with the French. Okay? And so they have these fantastic parties. They drink a lot of wine. They sing a lot of songs. And they write this Constitution, which is beautiful. It talks about everything they love about each other. And then they wake up the next morning. And they realize, God, were you like this last night? And it would fail. So Madison set out to create this divided government because he realized that by having different constituencies and different components working with and against each other, you could check these bad aspects that humans have. So in Federalist number 51, one of the most important of the Federalist Papers, Madison said, we've divided the government on two levels. He said, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments. It's first divided between two distinct governments. And then the portion allotted to each subdivided among different, distinct and separate departments. What he was saying is that we first created this federalism system. We divided power between the states and the federal government. And then we divided it again in the federal government. We created these three branches. Well, how can division bring unity? How is that going to make us better? The answer is, it does. Because it breaks up power into smaller bits so that you can do something about it when someone tries to take it from you, when that's one of your liberties. Federalism was essential to the passage of the United States Constitution. I don't live far from where George Mason lived, at Gunston Hall. In fact, one of my relatives was his neighbor. James Turley was his neighbor. The Turleys fought on the wrong side of every war, by the way. They fought for the king again in the Revolutionary War. And they were really horrible people. But George Mason was very concerned about the concentration of power in the federal government. And he was also very concerned about the absence of protections for individual rights. I'll tell you what, George Mason should be known to every school child in this country. He was, among greats, one of the greatest. He's not known that well. But he saw the problems when we were creating Constitution. And his good friend was James Madison. And I'll tell you what, James Madison is one of those framers that looks as good up close as far away. I got to tell you, you get close, look close to some of the framers, they don't come off as good. Once you go to that high-def TV image, Thomas Jefferson, bit of philanderer and, You know, George Washington was a bit of a severe case. He's not the guy you wanted to spend a weekend with. Okay, I mean, he had a severity to him that sort of put a damper on any party. But everyone liked James Madison. He was the go-to guy. He was the one that resolved this fight between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians. You think politics today is poisonous? Ha! You know, back in the days of the Federalists and the Jeffersonian, Jefferson referred to the tenure of the Federalists in office as the reign of the witches. So it wasn't that much better back then. But James Madison promised Mason that if Mason wouldn't oppose the U.S. Constitution, he would create a Bill of Rights, and guaranteed that the U.S. Constitution would be based on federalism principles. If he had not made the promise of federalism, there is no way the U.S. Constitution would have been ratified. None. It was ratified based on a promise of federalism, that the rights, the liberties of citizens would stay in the states where they're more likely to see them being frittered away. How far have we come? Now the federal government's huge. And many of the guarantees of federalism are gone. One of the biggest protections of federalism was that state senates, the state Senate, the state legislature, would elect senators. So a U.S. senator wouldn't do much to diminish the power of the state because they gave you your job. So if the state didn't like what you were doing in Washington, guess what? You were back saying, you want fries with that burger? Back home. Okay, you were out of a job. The other big change is federal income tax. It used to be that all of the revenue needed to get anything done was held by the states. So the federal government had to work with the states to get them to help pay for things. And that was gone. And so the federal government began to increase. And by the way, I think the federal government should have increased. I've had no problem with the large federal government. We have to have a larger federal government in today's world. But we've seen a steady erosion of states' rights. And that has produced great changes. And the problem is there are a number of other changes that are fundamentally altering the American government, and nobody seems to be talking about them. One is the rise of the fourth branch, as it's called, which is this huge administrative state that we have. Now, once again, I like most of the work of these federal agencies. But we now have a huge federal bureaucracy that is operating largely independently of either Congress or the White House. It is closer to an English ministry system. But we haven't really talked about how that affects our democratic rights. We also have the rise of what some of us call the Imperial Presidency. That's a term that Richard Nixon talked about. He wanted the creation of the Imperial Presidency, this uber president with huge amounts of power. George W. Bush pushed that model farther than any president in history, but it was Barack Obama that has really realized the Imperial Presidency. He has assumed so much power as president that as a civil libertarian, I find it terrifying. Nadine talked about the kill list, where President Obama has said that he has the right to kill any American citizen anywhere in the world on his sole authority. We have an expanded security state with huge levels of surveillance that are now going on without any warrants or serious judicial review. We're living increasingly in a fishbowl society. Your generation has less of an expectation of privacy than my generation, and my generation had less of an expectation than my father and mother's generation. We're living in a fishbowl society. You're used to it now. When you get up in the morning, you get into a car and you drive along a highway, and you're under surveillance. You pull into a 7-Eleven and get your big gulp, you're under surveillance. You get back in your car, you follow that surveillance highway to your work or your school, and you're under surveillance. My own classroom where I teach constitutional law is a big sign that a lot of universities have that says, this room is under surveillance. When I teach privacy, I teach it underneath this sign. The problem is that our protection of privacy depends on our expectations of privacy. And your generation has the lowest expectations of privacy as any generation in history. So everything's going the wrong way. You're changing. You have less expectations of privacy. We have a president that has unprecedented power. We have states that have never been less powerful. The question is, how does that change us? Well, not well. You people ask, why are there so few people voting? It's because people don't think it matters. They just don't think it matters. They don't think they matter. They see this government in Washington, D.C., and they don't think they have any voice in it at all. If that trend continues, they won't have a voice in it. They won't matter. That's why the framers believed in the federalism system. Now, part of the problem is the Supreme Court, is that the Supreme Court began to loosen up controls on federal jurisdiction. Probably the lowest point came with Wickard versus Filburn in 1942. In that case, the court looked at this concept of interstate commerce. You see, one of the protections of states' rights is that the federal government can only regulate interstate commerce, commerce between the states, right? That's part of the big reason we went out of the Articles of Confederation. Everything was chaos, right? Florida was putting up all types of barriers to neighboring states. People were even coming out with their own money, if you can imagine that. You know, you get a Florida dollars. Yeah, that'd be worth a lot right now, wouldn't it? I don't know where it would be worth much. I don't know what state could produce its own currency. So this guy, this farmer, was just raising grain to feed his chickens. He wasn't even selling it interstate. It's just growing grain, feeding it to his chickens. And the federal government in 1942 regulated him. And he said, whoa, 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 whoa. Give me a break. This is intrastate. My chickens don't go over the border. Okay, I'm feeding them the grain. They're staying here, and I eat them right here. And the Supreme Court said, no, it's still interstate commerce. Why? Because that grain you're feeding your chickens means that you're not buying grain from other states. So this is a displacement effect, because it's all grain in the market. So when you use your grain to feed your chickens, some other grain is coming over the border. Many of us have long been critics of that rule because it blew away the limitations of interstate commerce. If feeding your chickens grain is interstate commerce, everything is interstate commerce. Well, what has happened then is that there has been this philosophical division on the Supreme Court. And I have to say, there's good faith arguments on both sides. Some justices, like Souter and Ginsburg, take the view that federalism will protect itself. That you have the right, you can vote, you can throw the bums out, as they say. Okay? And so the Supreme Court doesn't have to do anything to protect federalism, you can do it. You don't like what they're doing with states? Vote them out. Other justices take the opposite view, that with the loss of those things protecting federalism, like the direct election of senators, the rise of federal income tax, that the court has to be more protective. After all, the Constitution guarantees federalism, and so this court has to be more protective. So that's why the Supreme Court has fluctuated between federalism rulings and non-federalism rulings. Now, part of the problem with this is Congress. Because, you see, state issues are the forbidden fruit of the Constitution. You see, the colleagues of Congressman Frey, they want state issues because they're the really groovy issues. Those are the really cool issues, right? It's crime. Crime is great. For a politician, crime is great because you can always be tough on crime. You can never be tough enough on crime, right? But members of Congress fall over themselves to be tough on crime. Hang them on meat hooks. You get a standing ovation. But also other stuff like medical marijuana, assisted suicide. There's a good one, assisted suicide. How's that a federal issue? Some states believe that you have a right to commit suicide. Some don't. It seems a classic case where states should be left with the decision. But members of Congress, they weigh in on assisted suicide. And so you got this forbidden fruit, and the members are always eating it because it's so much better than trying to balance the budget. Right? That is so cool. I just imposed another criminal penalty as opposed to I just cut another program to balance the budget. So you have Congress with this insatiable appetite for state issues. You got the courts that are not that protective. Occasionally, they've gone too far. So you have the Gun-Free School Zones Act. This was a measure in Congress saying that we want gun-free school zones. Okay? Once again, it's like heroin in the arm of a member of Congress. What could be better than to go back and say, I sponsored the Gun-Free School Zones Act? And what could be worse than opposing that? Right? If you vote against that, it's like, I'm really not in favor of guns in school. I just have this sort of, it's sort of this arcane federalism issue. No, blah, 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 blah. Right? So all the members, they vote for that. Right? And the Supreme Court in Lopez struck it down and said that is a state issue. Even a majority of this court has to say that's a state issue. Then there's a Violence Against Women's Act. How do you vote against that? Could you imagine? Yeah. I'm standing to oppose the Violence Against Women Act. That'll take some explanation back home. And the Supreme Court said, no, that is a state issue, okay? The protection of people from crime like that is a state issue. But the court is divided in these cases. And then, of course, came the big moment, right? The health care law. Now, oh no. Health care. Now, by the way, I just want to say from the beginning, not that it matters, I am in favor of national health care. But I did not support the health care law because I thought that it violated federalism. Okay? It was a badly drafted law. I spoke on Capitol Hill when they first put this law forward, and I said, you know what? This reads like a first draft. This is a really badly drafted law. My first-year law students could do a better job on this law today. Okay? And it was a first draft. It passed because, they were pushing it through on a muscle play, and then Ted Kennedy died, and they couldn't bring it back to the Senate because they didn't have the votes. And so they put through a flawed law. Everyone agrees that law should have been edited and should have been redone. But the politics of the moment didn't allow it. And so all of a sudden, we have this law with very important issues, and in my view, very poorly drafted. And so the question became, what would be left of federalism? Now remember, the health care law was sort of like the Alamo of federalism. Right? Federalism has been losing, and it finally found itself on this last piece of territory. This falls, federalism falls. It was a very important issue, and the media was blowing this. I wrote a bunch of columns I write for USA Today, and I spent a lot of time in my column in USA Today saying, this is not about health care. This is honestly not about health care. And yet all the media attention was about, what the health care law says. If you listen to the Supreme Court argument, there's very little discussion of health care. What was really involved was federal and state authority and whether the federal government could penalize someone for not getting health care. So what the federal government was arguing is that an 18-year-old in Richmond who doesn't get health care insurance is a federal interstate problem. That the failure to get a product, which is health insurance, is a federal interstate problem. And those of us who opposed it, even from the left, said, look, let's be honest. If that's a federal problem, everything's a federal problem. There is no area left to the states because it's an act of omission. And so that's the issue that went to the Supreme Court. And what you ended up with was a very bizarre case ruling in where Chief Justice Roberts switched sides apparently at the last minute and ruled 5-4 to uphold the law. But it was a weird opinion. Okay? Because Roberts starts out praising federalism and upholding it. And then he plants a knife right in its back. It was something right out of Julius Caesar, where Roberts came really not to praise federalism, but to bury it. And it fell by the hand of a friend. See, what happened is that Roberts starts out really well, and for those of us that believe in federalism, we were grooving on this. Said, allowing Congress to justify federal regulation by pointing to the effect of inaction on commerce would bring countless decisions an individual could potentially make within the scope of federal regulation, and under the government's theory, empower Congress to make those decisions for him. This is the so-called broccoli point. That can the federal government say, you need to do this because it's going to make you better, and we'll make that decision for you. And so what was funny is the reporters that were reading that, and I work for NBC and CBS, so I've been there. But a lot of reporters were in front of the courthouse, and they read those lines, and they went on the air and said, it's a win. The law has been struck down, and then, of course, they didn't read the second half of the opinion, where Roberts switched justices and went with the 4 more liberal justices and said, it is a violation of federalism, but you can still do it as a tax. See, it was a odd moment because the Supreme Court had already decided in the first issue, the so-called Anti-Injunction Act question, which turned on whether this was a tax or not. And the Supreme Court had just said, no. This is not a tax. It's a penalty. So the Anti-Injunction Act doesn't work, and therefore we can look at this case. Okay? But then it went on to say, but it is constitutional. Why? Well, because it's a tax. And people were like, really? You just said it wasn't a tax. He goes, well, it wasn't a tax for that purpose. It is a tax for this purpose. Now, that was said even though the administration kept on saying it's not a tax. And Congress said it's not a tax. And in fact, after this ruling, the President of the United States came out and said, no, it was never a tax. But what Roberts said was, you cannot do this under the Commerce Clause. It's not interstate commerce, but you can do it as a tax. Well, the result is something like, the Maginot Line, in France, right before World War II, where the French built this huge Maginot Line filled with 200,000 Frenchmen. It's a massive fortress. It was incredibly impressive. And then the Germans just went around it. It didn't work very well when you didn't, sort of just go around the end. And so the Maginot Line was this idea of building a huge fortress that really was there for cosmetic purposes. And the question is that what's left of federalism? Federalism is now this big Maginot Line. The Supreme Court says you cannot do this as interstate commerce, but go ahead and do it as a tax. So what does that leave for federalism? What does that leave for us? Now, what's really interesting is how Roberts explained this. Because he basically said that Congress has the right to do this on what he called a functionalist approach of government. That we're going to interpret the Constitution to allow the sort of functions of the federal government to be able to continue, and tax is so important to that. Well, this functionalist approach is seen in the Supreme Court in a variety of areas, including the separation of powers. That there's this great shift of power over to the executive branch, the president, and that is also being done under what's called functionalism. I'm a critic of functionalists. I have a new academic study that's just coming out in which I'm very critical of functionalism. because it is shifting power away from the center of gravity in the Madisonian system. It's becoming unstable. The Madisonian system is carefully balanced. That's what gives it its stability, its integrity. That center of gravity has now moved so heavily to the executive branch and to the federal government, it doesn't resemble what the framers originally intended. Well, maybe you could say, well, so what? We're at different times. Different people. Well, that'd be fine, except that the division of that government was what protected our individual rights. And people are now not only separated from the political system, they're becoming increasingly separated from the centers of power, where their rights are being defined, abridged, in some cases denied. Look at what Nadine was talking about with civil liberties. I speak all over the country, as does Nadine. I'm going to Utah in 2 days to speak on this subject. There's no difference between speaking in Florida, Utah, Texas. Everyone is concerned about the loss of civil liberties. And no one feels that they have any voice in it at all. And indeed, in Congress seems completely insulated from the views of the American people. The American people can be opposed to wars, they don't end. The American people can be opposed to spending billions in Iraq and Afghanistan, doesn't change it. People feel that they're no longer participants. That's what happens when you shift power away from individuals and put it in some remote spot. We're living in a virtual democracy, and we don't even think that we have a role to play in it. We've become these sort of dull-eyed pedestrians watching our government pass by. It has to change. And unfortunately, my generation has done a horrible job. We've allowed the things that our fathers and mothers fought for to gradually drain away. It's going to be your generation. Either you're going to reverse it, or it's going to become the way it is. You've got to make a decision. And you've got to decide whether you care, whether this is just not that important to you. But remember this, it is very, very easy to lose rights. History has few examples of getting them back. At the end of the Philadelphia Convention, everyone was gathered all outside the building, and they wanted to know what was going to come out of the constitutional negotiations. And Benjamin Franklin came out first, and a woman by the name of Miss Powell ran up to him. And Miss Powell said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought? What have you created?" And Benjamin Franklin looked at her and said, "It's a republic, madam, if you could keep it." Those are the most chilling words I've ever heard from any framer. It's a republic if you can keep it. What Benjamin Franklin was saying is that any democratic process has the seeds of its own destruction. You have to keep it, is what he was saying. It doesn't keep itself. You have to fight for it, or you will lose it. That's a terrible burden. My generation failed it. The question is what your generation's going to do.
I came, and I apologize for being a little late. You're talking about your generation failed. Well, my generation is ahead of yours, and we didn't fail. My mom's third cousin is Thomas Jefferson, and I went to my cousin's school at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And many, many years ago, Professor, I decided I was going to become a professor too. I did it in physics and business. But one of the things I like about you, and I followed your career for many, many, many years, and you always shoot the straight stuff. You don't mince words, and you tell what you really feel, and I like that. But here's one thing I think we have a challenge right now about, and that is, how do we get good student journalists to report as journalists should report? And let me just give you a little background. I was listening to Meet the Press with David Gregory yesterday. he had the typical 4 liberals and 1, good guy, Peter King, on. And this guy, the Republican from New York, and this guy from the Atlantic, you know him, Goldberg, he went to the liberal school. And I've been to Harvard, I've been to the University of Virginia, and Penn State, and George Mason, Florida Tech, Stanford, and a bunch of other schools, Virginia Tech and Virginia. And I would like to have you tell these kids how they listen to professors, and I was one of them, and learn when there's rhetoric involved and when the professors are trying to toss their rhetoric at the kids. And I heard it at Harvard over and over. And, now we got a deal at BCC, Brevard Community College, where there's a professor of math trying to tell people vote for Obama with their little dealie, in their books and all. And you're a straight shooter. And again, I followed you. How do we get people in the professorship area to not try to influence these people one way or another?
Well, thank you very much for those comments. It's great to see a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, and I commend you from the Madisonian world. The answer is, I think you've made 2 very important points. One is, I have to say that most academics, most legitimate academics really enjoy a dialogue. If you have a professor and you challenge a professor and the professor gets bent out of shape, then he or she is not a very good academic. Because the thing, I got to tell you, I spend most of my time in class trying to tick off my students. So whatever position I think my students have, I take the opposite position. And if I'm lucky, people will be screaming at each other by the end of the class. If no one's screaming at each other, then I failed. Because these are issues that you should feel deeply, and teachers should want to have passions about them. You need to respect your professor's view. I think professors should be open about their views, but also to be open so that people can use them as a foil, to be able to discuss them, to debate them when they're relevant to the course. For the student journalists that you were mentioning, I will say this. One of the great rollbacks on civil liberties in this country has targeted students and student journalists. I have a blog where we spend a lot of time defending student journalists on my blog. It's one of the largest legal blogs. And we spend a lot of time looking and student journalists write to us. There's been a crackdown on student journalists being able to talk about controversial things. And I think that it's a terrible trend. You are about to become citizens, for God's sake. You should be trying out all of these rights, including free speech. You should be debating these issues. It's part of your education. Recently, we saw a school ban a student's article about how she felt that she was being harassed or denied the right to speak as an atheist. And she wrote this very reasoned column about what it's like to be an atheist in high school. You know what? I view that as a really good column. And then you can have a kid that's not an atheist talk about how these things play out in the schools. The school banning that column was ridiculous. And a local paper, to its credit, ran that column. And it was a really good column, and so did we. So as student journalists, you do need to try to fight for that. Not in an insulting way. I'm a big believer in civility. You need to show respect for your teachers and the principal, but you also need to say, sometimes you have to do some educating. And so you have to stand up for it and say, look, I understand, but this is a respectful article. We want to talk about politics or religion, and we want to do it in a way to have a dialogue. So we don't end up just having every article about how the Badgers football team went yesterday. There's other issues that concern us, and you need to fight for that.
I don't know if it's really a question or more of a statement, but it goes along when you were talking about the civil liberties and the states, how they're having restrictions and stuff like that. I know that I'm a big supporter of the ag industry, and I know for that the Department of Labor is proposing new rules for child labor, and a lot of the farm kids, they don't consider what they're doing on their family farms like slavery, because I know a lot of people are saying that now. And they would rather be working with mom and dad, on the farm, hands-on. And the new thing is restricting age limits. If you want to go in your barn, you can't do that because you'll get hurt. You want to mow the lawn, you can't do that, you're going to get hurt. And I think that's like really taking away from like the rights that we have like with families. I was wondering like what your stance on that was.
Well, I do think that the problem whenever you have national laws is you got to understand the other side, right? The government's saying, look, we need a bright line rule because we can't make a decision in hundreds of thousands of individual cases. We have to create a bright line rule because child labor was a horrible thing. But like any federal regulation, it's often too blunt of a tool. And I think that particularly on family farms, as long as the kids are going to school, I don't see why that would be prohibited. I mean, I've got 4 kids, 14 to 7, and they think that everything's slave labor in my house. And I always say that's right. And I believe, I'm a civil libertarian in my profession, but I'm authoritarian as a parent. I deny all rights, subject them to continual surveillance. I engage in things that would be cruel and unusual punishment. I enjoy that period of tyranny before they become 18. But I agree with you on that point.
One thing I noticed traveling during the summer as a teacher is the only problem I had traveling from one state to another was whether they allowed the right turn on red. And so are states really losing their uniqueness? Does it matter as much now if you live in Florida across the border in Georgia as it did 50, 100 years ago? Are we just losing that?
Boy, that's an amazing good question. And I have to say, by the way, to the people around here that are your teachers, the most important people in my life were my teachers from high school and elementary school. And I want you to understand, these people that are teaching you took huge sacrifices to be teachers. They don't get paid nearly as much as they should. And they work so much harder than we do at the university level. When I look at their schedules, I feel ashamed. I mean, when I speak to like history and social studies teachers, it's the only time I actually don't call myself a teacher, because I feel a bit ashamed to say it in front of real teachers. I mean, so you need to understand, those people that are here with you today, they are doing work that's not just essential for this country, but essential for you, and you owe them a great debt of gratitude. Now, in terms of that question, it's a perfect question. And the answer is, yeah. I mean, we have these things, this new tradition in which the federal government and Congress routinely admits that it takes more in taxes than it actually needs. So Congress constantly overtaxes for the sole purpose of giving it back to the states with strings attached. And that's how you end up with states where the only difference is turned right on red, is because we collect so much more taxes, and then we start handing it back to the states, saying, if you want money for highways, you have to do X, Y, and Z. If you want money for healthcare, you have to do, X, Y, and Z. And so states, because they are no longer the dominant party in this relationship, constantly yield to these federal mandates. And I've been a big critic of that for years, because I think it is wrong. But even the most conservative members of Congress, they say that they're for federalism, but they vote for all these things. Take a look at the people that voted for the Gun-Free School Zone Act. It is virtually every member of Congress, including people who say they believe in federalism. And the same thing happens with these federal mandate issues. They take more in taxes to force every state to look like the federal government. And it's wrong. And by the way, it's not good for government. There's this idea that the federal government knows best. That's not always true. The whole idea of having 50 sovereign states is because sometimes states come up with better approaches, better ways of handling things. It's like having 50, the Supreme Court once referred to as having 50 gardens grow. And that's a good thing. Thank you very much. It was a great honor to speak to you.